welcome to Mythology and Folklore of Danny Hoots. I am Danny Hoots, and today we'll be talking about the goddess Persephone. Now, as I said in my last god mythology video of Hades, there's a lot of different views on the gods modernly than there is in the past. Like today we have a lot of stories about Persephone through Underworld, Lore Olympus, and a lot of songs, Percy Jackson, my own books, and video games, etc. But in the historical stories, in mythology, in what writings we have, there isn't too much about Persephone compared to how fascinating she is to us modernly. This could be due to her being part of the underworld, and like Hades, you don't go to the underworld and come back, at least not normally. And it could also be due because she's not in Olympus, and a lot of the Olympus gods are the focus of many stories. So today I'll be talking about how she became the goddess of the underworld and some other stories I didn't talk about in my last video about Hades. So to start off, who was Persephone? She was the daughter of Demeter and Zeus, and when she was born, she was said to have been the most beautiful maiden in the entire history of the world. She was more beautiful than Aphrodite, and men were lining up to propose to her. Even the god Apollo and Hermes were trying to propose to her and wanted to wed her, even though they weren't gods who would ever commit to someone. And her mother Demeter did not like this. She's like, no, I'm not letting my daughter be part of any god or human man's relationship. No. And who could blame her, just knowing all the other Greek stories. So she took her daughter Persephone and hid into the countryside, and some say it was near Sicily. And then there, she wanted Persephone to stay a virgin god like Athena and Artemis, and she was constantly surrounded by nymphs and servants, making sure she's fine. And Persephone liked this part of her life because she was with nature. She was supposed to be a goddess of fertility like her mother, and she just got to hang out and pick roses and flowers constantly. And then, depending on the legend, Hades went to Zeus to ask for a wife, and at that time there was no one really left. So there was virgin gods who weren't going to wed anyone, and then there was Persephone. So Zeus finally agreed that Hades could have Persephone, at least according to some stories. And so Hades went down to retrieve Persephone. Now, no one told Persephone or Demeter this, because, Greek mythology. And so Persephone was just hanging out one day, gathering flowers, and then suddenly she saw a daffodil or narcissus. And she thought it was the most beautiful thing in all of the land. She reached down to grab it, and the earth opened up. A man on a golden chariot came, snagged her, and went down the underworld, and the world went back to normal. Then her servants at that time weren't near her. They had gone overhead, or Persephone had gone ahead. And so no one knew what happened to Persephone. She just disappeared. And at that time, Demeter was very, very sad, was crying, and when the goddess of fertility and agriculture cried and was sad, that meant everything in nature started to die. Demeter then went to Hecate and asked her to help, because she has 2 torches that can light up anywhere in the world. And so they looked everywhere in the world, which she wasn't in the world, and there was no sign of Persephone. So at this time, and depending on the legend, Zeus either knew or didn't. So she went up to Olympus and said, I can't, it's been months later, and she went up to Zeus and begged him to do something, and Helios overheard the conversation and is like, oh, I know who did it. And everyone's like, why didn't you say anything? And he's like, no one asked me. Which I could go on a rant on how that was like today's society, but I won't. And so he said, it was Hades. I saw him come in his chariot, grab her, and go to the underworld. So Demeter made Zeus go to the underworld to talk to Hades. Now when Zeus goes to the underworld to talk to Hades, Hades like, hey, bro, you promised me her, like, this was already a conversation, and Zeus is like, yeah, but Demeter's scarier. And everything's dying, and I can make it so no soul can go to you. And he's like, fine, I'll return her in one day. So that night, Hades goes to Persephone and tells her, hey, you can leave tomorrow, but hey, want some pomegranates before you go? And like, who says no to pomegranates? So, Persephone took 6 or 3 to 9, depending on the story or where you live, and how many days of winter or months of winter there are, but the normal amount is 6. She took them, and then the next day when Zeus found out, he said, well, now you have to stay in the underworld for 6 months, and in 6 months you can be with your mother. So Hermes flies Persephone back up to the world, and Demeter and her hug, and then everything got to be blossoming again, and that's our spring. And then once Persephone has to go into the underworld for winter, that is when, winter happens, so things go back into the ground and there's no fertility on the land. Now, the legend of Hades abducting Persephone is pretty well known if you know anything about Greek mythology, and it's one that is discussed a lot and inspires different comics and books and stuff. And like in the Greek myths, there's nowhere does it say that she hates her life, and it's actually like noted she's a really great goddess of the underworld. And like I think today when we look at that story, there's different ways you could definitely take that story, but we kind of see it as, what if, since Demeter was such an overbearing mom and didn't want anyone to see her, that maybe she did fall in love, like this great goddess of life and spring, fall in love with darkness and death in the underworld. And then it's just forbidden love, and I think a lot of us love that story of just forbidden love, and they live happily together, or mostly do. And then other stories with Persephone that aren't as well known include the ones I talked a lot about in my last video of Perseus, Menthe, Lethe, Hercules, and Orpheus. So if you want to check those stories out, go check my Hades post, so I just don't want to reiterate the same stories. It's also in my blog, which is dannyhoos.com/mythology-blog, or just dannyhoos.com/Hades to check that one out. And this one will be dannyhoos.com/Persephone. But to talk about stories that I did not include in the last post is Adonis. Now, Adonis was a human male that was born and was just the most beautiful boy in existence, and Aphrodite fell in love with him, which I won't even comment on, but she didn't want anyone else to find out about him, because any tale of a god or goddess falling in love with a human always ends horribly. So, like you do, she took the child and took him down to the underworld and said, Persephone, can you watch him? So, like, no one sees him until he grows up and is a man and can fight. And in some stories, he's like in a chest, and then some it's like her just watching over him, and Persephone's like, yeah, I'll do that. But then he grew up to be a really handsome man, and Persephone's like, I want him. And so when Aphrodite came back to get him, Persephone's like, no, you can't have him. And they fought, and then Zeus came down and said, okay, 4 months Adonis is with Persephone, 4 months with Aphrodite, and what do you want to do, Adonis? And he's like, I'll use the other 4 months to be with Aphrodite. Now that tale actually ends horribly, and Adonis dies. And then now I'm like, But wouldn't that mean he's in the underworld all year and Persephone's with them? And they don't, and all the stories don't quite know what happened to him? And who sent that boar? Persephone is also mentioned in the story of King Admetos, who was given the chance if someone would die for him when the day he died, he could live forever. And so on the day of when he was supposed to die, his wife actually said, you know, I'll take your place. And she died when she was in the underworld. Persephone's like, you know, that was a moving story. I'm going to let you go back to the world and be with your husband. And she got to live longer. And another story, one of the harsh trials for Psyche, Aphrodite told her to go ask Persephone for her nightly beauty cream. And Psyche was like, okay. And makes it through the underworld with all the stuff that Aphrodite tells her to do. And Persephone put something in the box, and then when Psyche went back to the Earth and made it back home, before she got to Aphrodite, she's like, you mean, I want to be beautiful like a goddess, and opens it up, and the sleep of Hades overwhelms her, and she passes out and never moves again. Now, in that story, I'm not sure if, like, it was triggered so any human that looked at it did that, or if Persephone was still mad about Adonis and was like, this is how I'm going to get back at Aphrodite. We don't really know. A couple other mentions of Persephone in the story of Hercules, which again I mentioned in my video about Hades. But I didn't mention in that video that she welcomed Hercules like a brother because he went and participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, so that he would be welcomed by her. There's also the story of Persephone helps fight against the giants who were trying to avenge the Titans, and she attended the marriage of Thetis and Peleus, and she takes Euphemia to the underworld after Artemis kills her. So Persephone was said to have 3 children, Zagreus, Melanoi, and Erinyes. Zagreus was the offspring of Persephone and Zeus. Zeus came to her bedroom as a serpent, and Zeus did what he always does when he wants to sleep with someone. Regarding Melanoi, that one is said also to be Zeus, and he disguised himself as Hades. And then she had Melanoi. And then there's Erinyes. Erinyes could be either Hades or Zeus, because it was, the documents say Zeus Cathanois, which is like the Zeus of the could mean Zeus of the underworld, and Hades is like the ruler of the underworld if we're using the word Zeus as ruler. So that one could be either way. And then lastly, I want to touch on the worshipping of Persephone. Persephone was worshipped with her mother Demeter, especially as herself as the maiden. So a lot of the times she's referenced as Cora in these places. The cult of Demeter and the maiden, again Cora means the maiden, was found at Attica, and there was evidence of laws and rituals having to do with Persephone and Demeter and Eleusis. The Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated at the full moon nearest the last harvest, and this included dancing, magic, rituals, and using hallucinants. I will later have a video and post about these Eleusinian mysteries, and because I did a lot of research in my herbs and history class, because it's interesting what they found out, what kind of herbs and mushrooms and stuff that they may have used. So, thank you for watching about Persephone. If you love Persephone and Hades and want to read some fiction, I've written a series called The Daughter of Hades, and then the sequel duology called Queen of the Underworld. And then the first book's available for only 99 cents. There's a link below. My next video will be about Artemis, so I hope you enjoy. And then next month is October, so I will be doing more scary myths, which will be announced later. And then make sure you check out my Instagram. And next month I'm also starting doing a mythology post every day, or close to every day, probably like 5 days a week, where you just get to learn a mythology and folklore fact each day. So thank you, and see you later.